The morning Harlan Briggs rode up to their fence, he didn't bother to dismount. He just sat there on that big black horse, looking down at Mara Ellsworth the way a man looks at something he's already decided doesn't belong, a slow, contemptuous sweep from her heavy boots up to her face, his lip curling like he'd smelled something rotten. "Your husband home?" he said. Not to her, past her. Mara was standing right there, holding a feed bucket, looking straight at him. "I'm talking to you," she said. Harlan finally looked at her, really looked, and then he laughed. Not a short laugh, a long one, the kind that was meant to follow a person home. "Sweetheart," he said, "a woman built like a barn door's got no business trying to run a homestead that's barely standing." Before we go any further, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who couldn't see past what you looked like, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us all the way through, because what Mara Ellsworth found inside that mountain changed an entire valley, and nobody saw it coming. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1881. The geese were the first thing Mara noticed were gone. Not all of them. Just gone in that particular way. They had developed in the past 3 weeks that sudden, wordless column of 40 birds, organizing themselves without any signal she could detect, turning their long necks in the same direction and walking, steady and certain, toward the base of the mountain that pushed up against the back edge of their land like a wall. Someone forgot to finish building. She noticed it the first time on a Tuesday late afternoon, the sky going that particular shade of bruised gold that comes before the cold really settles in for the night. She'd been patching the corner of the fence where the second oldest mule, the one Silas called Bonaparte, for reasons he'd never fully explained, had been leaning his considerable weight. She looked up, and the geese were just moving, all of them, in a line, toward the mountain. She watched until they disappeared behind the thick curtain of juniper that ran along the base. She waited. 15 minutes. 20. Then the light went fully and she had other things to do, and by the time she remembered to look again, they were back in the yard, pecking at the frozen ground like nothing unusual had happened. The second time was Thursday. The third time was Saturday. By the fourth time, she stopped pretending it was a coincidence. Silas was the practical one, or at least that was what he told himself, which meant he trusted systems and distrusted mysteries. When Mara mentioned the geese at supper, he chewed his salt pork for a moment and said, probably following something. A smell. Warmth from a hot spring, maybe. He said it with the tone of a man who has successfully identified a problem and moved on, and he went back to eating. Mara didn't push it. She rarely pushed things directly. It wasn't that she was quiet by nature. Anyone who'd spent more than 20 minutes with her knew better than that. It was more that she understood, in a way she couldn't always put into language, that some arguments weren't worth having until you had something solid to put on the table. And right now all she had was a hunch and a line of geese. But the hunch was loud. She'd grown up in Missouri, in a household where things got used until they were dust, where nothing was wasted and everything was studied because you couldn't afford to ignore some things that might save you later. Her mother had been that kind of woman, quiet eyes that saw everything. Mara had inherited the eyes. She'd also inherited the build, broad shoulders, heavy frame, the kind of body that drew comments from strangers the way a lightning rod draws weather. She'd stopped being hurt by it somewhere around age 14. Mostly. The comments still landed. She just didn't show it anymore. Harlan Briggs had been the worst of them since she and Silas arrived in the valley that past spring. He was 43 years old and ran the biggest operating spread in the area, which in his mind made him the nearest thing to an authority figure the valley had. He had 4 hired hands, a proper barn with actual milled lumber, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything, and therefore never having learned what being wrong actually feels like. He'd come by the homestead twice since they arrived. The first time was nominally to welcome them, but he'd spent most of the visit addressing his remarks to Silas while Mara stood 2 feet away. The second time was to ask again, to Silas, whether they'd considered selling the back quarter of their land, since it abutted his grazing rights, and it would be cleaner for everyone if the boundary was settled. Silas had looked at Mara, because that was the right thing to do, and Mara had said, "We're not selling anything, and Harlan had smiled with his mouth only and ridden away. That was 6 weeks ago. Then came the morning he rode up to the fence. Mara had been up since before light, which was not unusual. There was always something: a loose board, a water barrel to check, feed to distribute, the endless inventory of small catastrophes that a homestead produces like a living thing producing cells. She was carrying the feed bucket when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find Harlan sitting on that enormous black horse, not dismounting, not greeting her, just sitting there above her with that look she'd come to recognize. The measuring look. The kind that added everything up and found the sum insufficient. "Your husband home," he said. There was a version of Mara who would have gone to get Silas. She'd been that version once. She remembered what it felt like, the hot shame of it, pretending you chose to make yourself smaller. "I'm talking to you," she said instead. He looked at her then, and he laughed. "Sweetheart," he said, "a woman built like a barn door's got no business trying to run a homestead that's barely standing." She didn't move. She was aware of the weight of the bucket in her hand. She was aware of exactly how far away the house was. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was not rapid, it was slow and hard and cold. "You came here to say that," she said. "I came," Harlan said, leaning forward in the saddle, "because they're dark, because there's already talk in town about whether you two are going to make it to spring. And I want Silas to know, neighbor to neighbor, that when you're ready to sell, I'll pay fair. No need to wait until you're desperate." He said, "You're ready." "Not you both." Not even a gesture toward her. "We're not going to need to sell," Mara said. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite respect, but was adjacent to reassessment. Then he straightened in the saddle. "We'll see about that," he said. "Winter up here has a way of clarifying things." He pulled the horse around and rode back up the trail without another word. Mara stood there until the sound of hooves faded. Then she picked the feed bucket back up and kept walking. Silas found her an hour later, still doing the rounds. He'd seen Harlan from the window, watched him ride up and ride away, and he'd chosen to let Mara handle it, which was one of the things she loved about him. He wasn't a man who had to be in every moment. He trusted her judgment the way you trust a wall you've tested, completely, and without needing to keep testing it. "What did he want?" Silas said. "The usual," Marissa said. "He wants us to fail so he can be the one who catches us." Silas was quiet for a moment. He was a lean man, sun-darkened, with hands that looked like they'd been borrowed from someone twice his age. He'd grown up hard in Tennessee and carried the evidence of it in the way he moved, careful, deliberate, like someone who had learned early that wasted energy was a debt that came due eventually. "We're not going to fail," he said. "No," Mara said. "We're not." But standing there in that cold morning light, she wasn't certain she believed it yet. The supply numbers were worse than she'd let Silas see. The flour was going to run out before February. The preserved meat wouldn't stretch past January if the cold came early, which everyone said it would. The geese were their best asset: the eggs, the meat, the possibility of trade, but only if the flock stayed healthy, and right now the flock was spending every evening disappearing into a mountain. That night she lay awake for a long time. In the darkness she thought about her mother, who used to say that the most dangerous thing in the world was a problem you'd convinced yourself was too small to look at carefully. The geese were a small problem. Or they were a symptom of something. She couldn't tell yet. The next afternoon she followed them. She didn't tell Silas. She packed 2 candles, a length of rope she coiled around her shoulder, and the small hunting knife she kept on her belt. She left a note on the table following the birds, back before dark, and walked out across the frozen ground toward the mountain. The geese were already moving when she stepped out of the cabin, that purposeful, single-file line of them threading between the frozen tufts of grass. She kept her distance. She didn't want to spook them, didn't want to interrupt whatever it was they were following. She watched the first ones disappear into the juniper shadow, and she kept walking. The junipers were dense enough that the light changed immediately when she stepped under them from pale winter sun, something dim and greenish and cave-like. The geese were ahead of her, still moving. She could hear their feet on the frozen ground, the soft occasional sounds they made to each other, a language she couldn't understand, but which sounded tonight like something deliberate. Then they stopped. She stopped too. She could see them clustering at the base of the rock face, a cluster that tightened, shifted, and then, one by one, disappeared into the rock itself. It took her another full minute of standing still before she understood what she was seeing. Not a cave mouth, not a gap, in a sense she had any previous image for, but a crack, a vertical seam in the stone, shoulder wide maybe at its broadest, maybe less. The kind of opening that your eye slides off of if you're not looking for it specifically. The geese were going through it, all 40 of them. She walked to it, slowly, her candle out, and held the flame near the crack. The flame pulled toward it immediately, not away from toward. Warm air. Coming from inside, she put her hand into the opening. The warmth that met her fingers was extraordinary. Not hot, not the burn of a geyser, just stable, even. The kind of warmth that belongs to a place that has been sheltered from weather for a very long time. She stood there with her hand inside the mountain for a moment that felt much longer than it probably was. Then she pushed her candle in, sideways, and looked. The crack went back at least 6 feet before she could see any light change, which meant it opened into something larger. She pulled the candle out. She looked down at herself, her broad frame, her heavy shoulders, the actual width of her body, and understood immediately what the problem was going to be. She was too big to fit through comfortably. She pressed herself against the rock and put one shoulder in first, turning sideways, exhaling the way you exhale when you're trying to fit through something that doesn't want you. The stone pressed against her chest and against her back simultaneously. She could feel her heart going fast now. She pushed forward another inch. The rock scraped at her coat. She stopped. Don't force it, something in her said. Not without the rope. Not alone. She backed out. She stood in the juniper shadow, breathing hard for a moment, looking at the crack. 20 yards away, the last goose had already disappeared inside. She made herself stay still and think. She could hear water, faintly from somewhere beyond the rock. Or maybe she was imagining it. She couldn't tell. But the warmth was real. The warmth was absolutely real. She went home. Silas was at the table when she came through the door. He looked at her once, at her scraped coat, at her face, at whatever expression she was wearing, and he set down his cup. "What did you find?" he said. She sat down across from him. "I don't know yet," she said, "but we need to go back tomorrow. And we need to bring more rope." She didn't sleep much that night either, but for a different reason. Before, she'd been lying awake, worrying. Now she was lying awake thinking, which was something else entirely. She was thinking about the warmth, about what could produce that kind of stable warmth inside a mountain in November, about the geese going in there night after night and coming back out again, about what a place like that, if it was what she was starting to think it might be, could mean for two people trying to survive a winter that everyone in the valley was already calling the one that might finish the smaller homesteads. About Harlan Briggs's voice when he said, "Winter up here has a way of clarifying things." She was thinking about what it would mean to be ready for him when spring came. Silas reached over in the dark and found her hand. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," she said back. "You're thinking loud," he said. She almost laughed. "Sorry. Don't be." A pause. "Whatever it is you found, we'll figure it out together, like we do everything else." She squeezed his hand. She didn't answer because she didn't trust her voice quite yet, and because there are moments in a marriage where the words aren't the thing. The thing is the hand. Outside, the wind picked up from the north. The geese were somewhere inside the mountain, warm and quiet. And Mara Ellsworth stared at the ceiling of their weather-beaten cabin and understood, with a certainty that was not hope but something much harder than hope, that they were not going to fail. Not if she could help it, not this winter, not ever. The rope was Silas's idea, but the sled was Mara's, and that distinction mattered more than either of them realized at the time. They went back the next morning before the light had fully settled into the valley, when the cold sharp enough to make breathing feel like swallowing glass. Mara had lain awake most of the night, not worrying this time, but planning, which was a different kind of sleeplessness entirely, the kind where your mind keeps turning a thing over and over, looking for the side that makes sense. By the time Silas got up to start the fire, she was already dressed and sitting at the table with a piece of brown paper she'd been using to sketch rough measurements. "You measured yourself?" Silas said, looking at the paper. "Crack," she said. "I measured the crack. Best I could judge it." He looked at the numbers she'd written. He looked at her. He didn't say anything about the obvious problem, which she appreciated. We'll need the longer rope, he said instead. The one we used for the roof beams. Already sets it out. He poured himself coffee and stood there drinking it, looking at the paper. What do you think is in there? I think we should find out before we decide what to think. That was the right answer, and they both knew it. The wrong thing to do, the thing most people did, in Mara's experience, was to decide what something meant before you'd actually seen it. You could ruin a good thing that way, or walk into a bad one. She'd watched her father do it her whole childhood. Form a conclusion, and then look for the world to confirm it. It was an easy way to live, and a dangerous one. They packed 2 extra candles, a small hammer, the rope, a length of flour sack cloth folded flat, and the hunting knife. Mara also packed a stub of charcoal for marking the walls if they needed to track their path. Silas asked if they should bring a firearm, and Mara thought about it genuinely, not dismissively, which was one of the things she did that he sometimes forgot to admire. She took questions seriously even when they had obvious answers. No, she said finally. If there's something living in there big enough to hurt us, a pistol shot in an enclosed space is going to cause more problems than it solves. Silas nodded. He hadn't thought about the echo. That was the marriage in miniature. They reached the junipers as the sun was just beginning to clear the eastern ridge, throwing long flat shadows across the frozen grass. The geese were still inside, they hadn't come back out yet, which told Mara something she filed away, without deciding what it meant. She knelt in front of the crack and held the candle near it again. The warm pull was still there. If anything, it felt stronger in the cold morning air, the contrast more pronounced. You feel that? She said. Silas crouched next to her and held his bare hand near the opening. His eyebrows went up. That's not a hot spring, he said. No, she said. Hot spring smell. This doesn't smell like anything. Then what's producing it? I don't know yet. She handed him one end of the rope and tied the other end around her own waist with a knot her mother had taught her, the kind that could be released with one pull if she needed to free herself quickly. Silas didn't love this plan. She could tell from the way he held the rope with both hands before she'd even started moving. He was the kind of man who expressed worry through the tightness of his grip on things. If I pull twice, she said, you pull me back. If you pull once, then I'm fine, and I'm just letting you know I'm still here. How often are you going to do that? Every couple of minutes. Make it every minute, he said. She didn't argue. She turned sideways and pressed herself into the opening. The second time was worse than the first, because this time she knew what to expect. The stone pressed against her chest and her back with a kind of impersonal indifference, not hostile exactly, just completely unconcerned with whether she passed through or not. She exhaled as fully as she could, feeling her ribs compress, and pushed forward with her trailing foot. The candle was in her leading hand, held up and away from the wall to protect the flame. The rope pulled tight behind her, around her waist. She made it 18 inches. She stopped. The rock was pressing against the widest point of her, not her shoulders but lower her hips, her ribs. She breathed out again and tried to angle herself slightly, rotating her upper body while keeping her hips turned. Something gave not the rock, but her coat, which folded and compressed in a way that found an extra quarter inch she didn't know she had. She moved forward. Another 6 inches? Another. The candle flame was steady and pointing ahead, not flickering, which meant there was no crosswind and she was still in a sealed passage. Then the pressure on her back eased, just slightly, then more. Then suddenly the stone was no longer touching her on both sides at once. She was through. She stood in surrender for a moment with her candle held up, breathing hard, taking in absolutely nothing visually, because her mind needed a second to catch up with the fact that she was standing in a space that was considerably larger than the space she'd just been in. She pulled the rope once. Silas's grip tightened and released in response. She could feel it. Then she raised the candle. The flame lit the nearest wall, and then the ceiling above it, and Mara's breath caught in the back of her throat. The chamber was enormous. Not enormous in the way of a cathedral, not that kind of soaring height, but enormous in the way of a space that has been doing its job for a very long time without any human involvement whatsoever. The ceilings arched maybe 15 feet above her, irregular and dark with minerals, and the walls swept outward in both directions further than her single candle could reach. The floor was dry stone, relatively flat, worn smooth in places as if water had once moved across it and then stopped. The geese were everywhere. She counted 14 within the circle of candlelight, scattered across the floor in the particular loose way that geese settle when they feel safe. They looked up at her with their flat orange-rimmed eyes and made small sounds, not alarm sounds. She'd learned to tell the difference, just acknowledgement sounds. You. We know you. You're the one with the feed bucket. Mara stood very still and looked around as her eyes adjusted. The walls were not bare. In the naturally worn hollows of the stone concave pockets, where softer rock had been gradually scooped by time and mineral water, there were eggs. Not a few. Not a nest's worth. Hundreds. She walked toward the nearest hollow slowly, not hurrying, the way you approach something you don't fully understand yet and don't want to disturb. She held the candle close to the nearest cluster. The eggs were pale, the slightly greenish-gray that goose eggs get, and they were stacked in the hollow, without any apparent arrangement, just the accumulated deposits of birds that had been coming here for seasons, maybe years, and laying in the same sheltered places again and again. She picked one up. It was cool but not cold. Cool the way a root cellar is cool, not the deep cold of outside, but a managed, stable temperature that didn't feel natural for November. She turned it in her fingers, studying it. It was intact. No cracks, no softening of the shell. She pressed it gently, and it didn't give. She put it down exactly where she'd found it. Then she walked further into the chamber, holding the candle out at arm's length. And the hollows kept coming. The geese kept appearing in the candlelight, untroubled. Somewhere to her left, she heard the soft, irregular sound of water, not a stream, but a seep. A thin thread of moisture running down one wall and collecting in a shallow basin worn into the floor. She touched it. Cold but fresh, she pulled the rope once. She pulled it again a moment later. She could hear Silas calling from outside, his voice muffled by the stone. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. She went back. The return through the crack was harder than the entry because she was moving backward and couldn't see what was behind her. She had to trust the rope and trust her own sense of where her body was in space, which was harder when you were also holding a candle and trying not to knock it against the wall. She emerged scraped and breathing hard, her coat worse for it, her hair pushed sideways and full of grit. Silas's hands found her arms before she was fully out. "You were in there for 20 minutes, he said, was it?" She'd lost track of time entirely. "Are you hurt?" "No." She dusted herself off, or tried to. "Silas, you have to see this. I don't fit through that crack any better than you do. I know. But I'll describe it and you'll understand." She paused, organizing what she'd seen into an order that would make sense to him. "There's a chamber in there. A big one. Maybe 60 feet across. Maybe more. I couldn't reach the far wall with the candle. The floor is dry. The ceiling is solid. There's a water seep on the western side. And the walls, Silas. The walls are full of hollows, like natural bowls in the stone, and the geese have been laying in them." He was very still. "How many eggs?" "More than I can count from one candle's worth of light." She looked at him. "Hundreds." The silence between them had a particular quality to it, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of arithmetic, full of implications, full of the same calculations running in both their heads simultaneously. Flour running out in February. Meat gone by January. The look on Harlan Briggs's face when he said winter up here has a way of clarifying things. "A cave that keeps a stable temperature," Silas said slowly. "Cool but not freezing. Like a natural larder," Mara said. "Yes. Those eggs could be. I know what they could be," she said. "But we're not touching anything yet. Not until I know more." He looked at her like he wanted to argue, and then thought better of it. He knew that tone. It wasn't stubbornness, it looked like stubbornness from the outside. He'd told her once, early in their marriage, and she'd explained patiently that there was a difference between refusing to move and choosing when to move, and that the difference was everything. He'd come to understand what she meant, eventually. "What do we need to know?" he said. "I need to go in 3 more times this week," she said. "I need to map it. I need to understand where the warm air comes from. There has to be a shaft somewhere, a vent. I need to count the active nesting areas separately from the older deposits. And I need to understand the temperature variations in different parts of the chamber before I know what's safe to take and what isn't." Silas looked at the crack in the rock. He looked at her scraped coat. He looked at her face, which was dirty and determined, and a little bit electric in a way he'd learned to recognize over the years. "All right," he said, "but we go in pairs. You go in, I stay out. We signal every minute. Every 2 minutes. Every minute and a half, he said, and that was final. She went back 4 times over the next 6 days. Each time she learned something new. Each time she came back out with charcoal marks on her hands and fresh notes scratched onto the brown paper. She kept folded in her coat pocket. The map she was building was rough. She was no surveyor, and the candlelight was unreliable, but it was accurate in the ways that mattered. She knew where the active nests were clustered, which was in the warmer sections of the chamber near what she was increasingly sure was a ventilation shaft, a narrow column somewhere in the eastern wall that allowed air to circulate from some deeper heat source she couldn't identify and didn't need to. She knew where the older egg deposits were. She knew the temperature differences between sections, warmer near the east wall, cooler near the water seep, most stable in the center. On the 4th visit, she found something she hadn't expected. In the far back of the chamber, past the point where she'd turned back on previous visits, the floor rose gradually and the ceiling lowered until the space became a long, lower tunnel going further into the mountain. She didn't go in, not without telling Silas, not without more rope. But she stood at the entrance to it and held her candle close to the floor, and she saw feathers. Goose feathers, a lot of them, distributed along the floor of the tunnel, going back, as far as the light could reach. The geese had been back there too, which meant either there was another exit which would change everything about how the cave functioned, or there was something else back there that was drawing them. She filed it away and came back out. That evening at the table, with the lamp between them and the wind starting its nightly argument with the cabin walls, she told Silas about the tunnel. "We go back on Saturday," she said. "I think we can widen the entrance. It's enough for you to get through if we're careful about it." "Widen how?" he said. "Very carefully," she said. He put his hands flat on the table. "Mara, if we crack the wrong support stone, I know, the whole passage could collapse. I know that. I'm not talking about attacking the thing with a pickaxe. I'm talking about removing small amounts as inches and only where the stone shows natural fracture lines. We dampen the points first. We go slowly." She looked at him. "You trust me or not?" It wasn't a challenge, the way she said it. It was a genuine question. "You know I do," he said. "Then trust me's on this too." Saturday came with a colder sky than they'd had all week, the kind of colorless gray that sits on the mountains and doesn't move. They brought tools, a narrow chisel Silas used for detail work, the hammer, rags for dampening the stone, and an extra coil of rope. Mara had spent 2 days studying the entrance from every angle she could manage, running her fingers along the edges of the crack, identifying the places where the stone was already under tension and the places where it was solid enough to bear interference. The narrowest point was about a foot into the crack, where a shelf of rock jutted inward on the right side. That was the point that was stopping Silas. It was also, as far as Mara could determine, a section of stone that was not load-bearing. In any meaningful way, it was a protrusion, not a pillar. "There," she said, pointing. "That shelf. We take maybe 2 inches off the face of it. No more." Silas looked at it for a long time. He ran his own fingers over it, feeling the grain. "The fracture line runs diagonal," he said. "Yes. Which means if we work with it instead of against it, we might get a clean break," he said, with a small strike. "One strike. One careful strike," she said, "after we've dampened it." He soaked the rag in the water from their canteen and pressed it against the stone shelf for a full 10 minutes. Then he positioned the chisel. Then he looked at Mara. "Step back," he said. "I want to watch." "Step back 2 feet, Mara." If something gives that shouldn't, she stepped back. The strike was quieter than she'd expected. A short, precise sound, not a crack exactly, more like the stone making a decision it had already been considering. A piece of the shelf, maybe 3 inches across and 2 deep, sheared away and fell to the ground at Silas's feet. He caught himself against the rock face with one hand, steadying, then straightened up. They both held very still for 5 seconds. The mountain did nothing. Silas exhaled. He held the candle into the crack. He looked at the new shape of the opening. "Try it," he said. Mara turned sideways and pressed in. The shelf was gone. There was still resistance, still the horrible press of cold stone on both sides, but it was a goatable resistance, the kind you could manage with the right angle, and a full exhale rather than the kind that simply stopped you. She made it through in 40 seconds, which was less than a third of the time the previous entry had taken. She came back out. Her face said everything. Your turn, she said. Silas was thinner than Mara, long and lean, but he had broad shoulders from years of physical labor, and those shoulders were the problem. He had to rotate further than she did, tilting his upper body at an angle that looked genuinely painful, and probably was. She watched from outside, holding the rope, counting his progress in inches. Once he stopped completely for almost 20 seconds, and she thought they were going to have to pull him back, but then he exhaled in a way that was nearly a sound and moved forward 3 inches, and then the resistance broke, and he was through. His voice came back through the rock, slightly muffled. Well, he said. She smiled into the cold air. Come in, she called back. There's something you need to see. She entered after him, faster now that she knew the path, and they stood together in the chamber for the first time. Silas had a lantern, they'd decided. A lantern would be worth the extra difficulty of carrying it through the crack, and in the stronger light, the chamber opened up in a way that the single candle had only suggested. The ceiling was higher than Mara had realized. The floor was bigger. The geese moved around their feet with complete indifference, and the hollows in the wall, in the lantern light, were staggering. Silas walked to the nearest one and crouched down. He counted under his breath for a moment. Then he straightened up and walked to the next one and counted again. He kept doing this without saying anything, moving from hollow to hollow with the lantern, and Mara let him because she understood what he was doing. He was the practical one. He needed numbers before he could feel anything. That was all right. She'd already had her moment of standing in the dark with her mouth open. When he came back to her, his face had a look she didn't see on it often. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter and more serious than excitement. I counted close to 200 eggs in the main hollows, he said. I think that's a low estimate, she said. There's more in the back section. The tunnel? The tunnel, she confirmed. He looked toward the back of the chamber where the ceiling dropped. He looked at the lantern. He looked at her. We should look, he said. Yes, she said. But not today. Today we just look at what we have. They spent another 40 minutes in the chamber. Mara showed him the water seep, the temperature variations she'd mapped, the ventilation shaft she'd identified a narrow column in the eastern wall, where the warm air flowed most distinctly, strong enough to move a candle flame from 3 feet away. Silas found 2 things she hadn't found, a second smaller hollow near the ceiling that was completely dry, which he thought might be ideal for longer-term storage of non-perishable items, and a series of small channels in the floor near the water seep that suggested the drainage was better than it looked. Water came in and went somewhere, which meant the floor wouldn't flood. This place, Silas said after a while. He stopped. Started again. Mara, this place is, I know, she said. No. Let me say it. He turned to look at her. The lantern between them made his face half light and half shadow. This place could keep us alive. All winter. Not just us. If there are 200 eggs here and more in the back, and if the geese keep laying, and if we manage this right, we don't know yet if we can manage it right, she said. That's the whole point. If we start pulling eggs without understanding the system, we could damage the colony, scare the birds away, disrupt whatever's making this place work, and then we'd have nothing. So we learn the system first. We learn the system first, she agreed. And we don't tell anyone about this yet. Silas's eyebrows came together. Not anyone, she said. Not until we understand what we have. Not until we know it's stable and sustainable. If word gets out and people come in here without understanding how it works. The Vosslers, Silas said quietly, he meant it as an agreement. Old man Vossler and his wife were the kind of people who took more than they meant to, not out of selfishness, but out of a long habit of scarcity that made you grab at things. They'd lost their youngest son the previous winter, and the grief had made them both worse at thinking ahead. The Vosslers, Mara confirmed. And others. And Harlan? She looked at him. Especially Harlan. They came out of the cave in the early afternoon. Both of them scraped and dirty, and breathing the cold outside air like it was something new. For a moment, they just stood in the juniper shadow without speaking, adjusting to the light, to the space, to the fact of the open sky above them, after the contained pressure of the stone. Then Silas said something that surprised her. How did they find it? He said. What? The geese. How did they find a cave with a warm air vent? How do birds know to look for something like that? Mara considered the question seriously, the way she considered all serious questions. Maybe they didn't look for it, she said. Maybe one of them stumbled on it by accident, and went in, and it was warm and safe, and they came back. And they told the others. Geese tell each other things? I think most things tell each other things, she said. We just don't always know what language they're using. Silas thought about that. So one bird had the sense to go somewhere strange, she said, and because of that bird, the whole flock survived. Started walking back toward the cabin. The frozen grass crunched under her boots. That's one way to look at it, she said. Back at the cabin, she lit the lamp and unfolded the brown paper and began writing more carefully, not the rough charcoal scratches of the in-cave notes, but a real record. Dimensions, temperature observations, hollow locations and approximate egg counts, the water source, the ventilation shaft, the tunnel and its unknown contents. She wrote it in columns because her mind worked. When it came to this kind of things, she knew things she needed to know, things she suspected but couldn't yet verify. Silas watched her from across the table for a while and then started building a mental list of tools they'd need. A narrower sled for moving eggs through the crack without breaking them, better rope, a second lantern, material for marking the hollows they harvested from so they could track what was being taken. We should try a retrieval test, Mara said without looking up from her paper. Small, 10 eggs, maybe 12, from the oldest deposits only. See how they've held. See how the birds react to the disturbance. And if the birds don't like it, she finally looked up. Then we figure out what they'll tolerate. They've been sharing this space with something. Geese don't lay in a spot that feels wrong to them. They chose those hollows, which means the hollows are right for eggs. We just have to understand what right looks like from a goose's perspective. I've spent 6 years trying to understand geese, Silas said, and I still don't know what right looks like from a goose's perspective. 6 years isn't long enough, she said. They've been working on this system a lot longer than we have. He looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, not quite admiration, something less performative than admiration. Something that said, you see things I don't, and I'm glad you're the one looking. She went back to her paper. Outside, the first serious clouds of the approaching winter were beginning to stack up against the northern peaks. Temperature was dropping faster than yesterday, and yesterday had been fast. There was a particular quality to the cold coming from the north that evening, dense and deliberate, the kind that settles in and doesn't offer a schedule for when it plans to leave. Mara felt it even inside through the cabin walls. She looked at her notes. She looked at the numbers she'd written in the margin, the egg count, the estimated weekly output of a healthy colony of 40 geese, the caloric value of a goose egg versus the remaining provisions she'd calculated 2 weeks ago. She ran the arithmetic carefully twice, and then let herself feel what she felt, which was a very careful, very provisional thing that she couldn't quite call relief yet. But it was in the same neighborhood as relief. Silas came up behind her and looked over her shoulder at the paper. He read for a moment, he said. Don't, she said. Don't say it out loud yet. Why not? She thought about how to explain it. Because if we say it and then something goes wrong, then something goes wrong, he said. We've had things go wrong before. I know, we're still here. I know that too. She put the pen down. She folded her hands on top of the paper. I just need to be sure first. I need to see it work before I let myself believe it. He didn't argue. He moved around to his chair and sat down and picked up the cup of cooling coffee he'd left there. The test retrieval, he said. When? Wednesday, she said. If the weather holds. The weather held. Barely. Wednesday arrived with a sharp sky and a wind from the northwest that had teeth in it, the kind of wind that finds the gaps in your coat, no matter how careful you've been about the seams. They went early and worked methodically, Mara inside and Silas at the entrance, the rope between them the way it always was now, not because they'd agreed to keep doing it, but because it had become the habit of the thing, the ritual that made it feel safe and manageable. Mara moved through the chamber with deliberate slowness she'd imposed on herself from the beginning. She chose a hollow in the central section, not the warmest, not the coolest, one of the mid-chamber deposits that showed clear signs of age in the eggs. She lifted 12 eggs, one at a time, and placed them in the cloth-lined basket she'd brought in around her neck. She cataloged each hollow she took from with a charcoal mark on the paper she kept in her pocket. She noted how the nearby geese responded, which was barely at all, a few sideways glances, a small shift of position from 2 birds closest to the hollow, and then nothing. No alarm. No departure. She passed the basket through the crack before she came out herself, pushing it ahead of her carefully, Silas taking it the moment it emerged into the open air. When she came out, he had the basket open and was looking at the eggs. He picked one up. He tapped it gently with one knuckle. He looked at it. "These are good," he said. "I know," she said. "These are genuinely." He stopped. He set the egg back down with a kind of careful reverence that she'd never seen him use with an object before. "Mara, I know," she said again, and this time she let herself feel it. The eggs were good. They were better than good. The cave's conditions had preserved them in a way that no root cellar, no buried crock, no carefully managed larder had ever managed to replicate in her experience. The oldest of the 12, by her estimate, had been in that hollow for weeks, maybe 6, maybe 8, and they were intact. They were whole. They stood there in the cold with the basket of 12 eggs between them and the wind cutting across the mountain's face and the juniper trees moving in slow arcs behind them, and Mara looked at the crack in the mountain and felt something she recognized after a moment as genuine, uncomplicated awe. Not the performance of awe, but the real thing, the kind that comes when the world shows you. It is stranger and more generous than you had any right to expect. 12 eggs. And inside the mountain, if the count was even close to right, more than 200 still waiting. "What's the next step?" Silas said. His voice was steady, but his hands were still holding the edges of the basket like he needed something to hold. Mara thought about it. She thought about the tunnel she hadn't explored yet. She thought about the ventilation shaft and whether they understood it well enough. She thought about the weeks of careful observation still ahead of them, the records she needed to keep, the patterns she needed to track before she could be confident that what they were doing was sustainable rather than just extractive. She thought about the storm clouds building on the northern horizon, further away than they looked, but not far enough. Next, she said, "I go back in and map the tunnel." And most of its windows were dark. And then she picked up the basket, and they started walking home, and the geese would come out of the mountain in the late afternoon and cross the meadow and take no particular notice of the 2 people standing at the fence watching them. Most of its windows were dark, and the mountain would keep its temperature in the way it had always kept its temperature. Seasons. And somewhere in the hollows of the eastern wall the remaining eggs would sit in the cold dark, exactly as they had been sitting, patient and whole, waiting. The tunnel went back further than either of them had imagined. Mara had gone in alone the first time, as she always did now not, because Silas couldn't manage the entrance crack anymore. They'd gotten that down to a manageable routine. Most of its windows were dark, but because the tunnel itself was narrower than the main chamber, and she wanted to map it before she brought anyone else in. That was her system, and she'd held to it across every visit. Understand the space before you use the space. Know what you're walking into before you walk into it. Most of its windows were dark. It was the same principle she applied to everything from buying provisions to talking to difficult people, and it had served her well enough that she'd stopped feeling the need to explain it. The tunnel's ceiling dropped to about 5 feet within the first 20 yards, which meant Silas would have had to hunch, and then it leveled off at that height for another 30 yards or so before the floor started rising again. Mara had gone in 3 times by the end of the second week, each time marking her progress on the cave wall with a charcoal stub and her initials, so she knew which marks were new. The air in the tunnel was different from the main chamber, drier, warmer, and with a faint mineral smell she couldn't identify, not unpleasant, but strange, the way some deep places smell of their own long solitude. The geese used the tunnel differently than they used the main chamber. In the main chamber, they wandered freely, spread out across the floor, settled in the loose groupings that geese prefer when they feel safe. In the tunnel, they moved in single file, always, and they moved with a directedness that was different from their chamber behavior, purposeful, in a way that reminded Mara of working dogs who know exactly where they're going and don't appreciate being distracted. She followed them on the 3rd tunnel visit, all the way to the back. What she found there rearranged her understanding of the entire system. The tunnel opened at its far end into a second chamber smaller than the first, maybe 30 feet across, with a ceiling that rose sharply back to 12 or 15 feet. The floor of this second chamber was warmer than anything she'd felt elsewhere in the cave. Not warm enough to be uncomfortable, not even warm enough to be uncomfortable, to break a sweat if you were standing still, but warm in the way a hearthstone is warm an hour after the fire has been banked. Residual and reliable. She held her candle to the floor and felt the heat rising through it into the cold air above. The eggs here were different too. Not different in kind, they were goose eggs. The same gray-green shells, the same size, but different in quantity and arrangement. While the main chamber hollows held the scattered deposits of birds, laying where the space felt right, the second chamber had a concentration that suggested something more intentional. 3 large hollows, each about the size of a washtub, filled to a depth of 4 or 5 inches, with eggs nested into each other, packed together in a way that preserved the heat between them like a communal blanket. Mara crouched next to the nearest one and held her candle close. She didn't touch them. Not yet. She just looked. She'd spent enough time around laying hens and geese and the particular logic of birds to understand something that a lot of people missed, that birds weren't random. They had preferences and systems, and something that functioned, if not exactly like memory, then close enough to it that the practical difference was hard to name. These geese had been using this cave for a long time, possibly for years before she and Silas had arrived in the valley. The deposits in the main chamber, the pathway habits, the organized approach to the tunnel, none of this was accidental. These birds had discovered something that worked, and they had kept using it. The warmth of the second chamber was the key. Something below the rock floor volcanic activity, maybe, or a deep thermal fault, was producing enough gentle heat to turn the back of this cave into an incubator. Not hot enough to cook the eggs, perfectly, improbably calibrated to preserve them. The first chamber caught warmth and moderated it against the cold outside air through the ventilation shaft, creating the stable, cool temperature she'd measured there. The 2 chambers worked together as a system, each one doing something the other couldn't do alone. She sat back on her heels and stared at the egg-filled hollows and felt the familiar sensation that had been visiting her with increasing frequency over the past weeks, that particular combination of awe and calculation that arrived when something beautiful turned out to also be useful. She pulled out her paper and started writing. She was in there for almost an hour before she remembered to pull the rope. The answering tension from Silas was more abrupt than usual. She pulled it twice quickly to reassure him, and heard his muffled voice from the main chamber. She'd convinced him to come through the entrance that day so she could call out to him if needed, though he'd stopped short of the tunnel itself. When she came back into the main chamber, his face told her she'd scared him. "An hour," he said. "I know, I'm sorry, I found something." She held up the paper. "The tunnel goes to a second chamber." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that cycled through relieved and annoyed and curious before landing on curious, because that was always where Silas ended up. How big smaller than this one? But Silas, the floor is warm. Geothermal, maybe. Something underground producing heat. And there are 3 large hollows full of eggs that are, she paused, looking for the right word, and settling for the honest one, remarkable. The preservation in there is even better than out here. He was quiet, processing this. So the whole cave is basically a system, she said. A complete system. The back chamber warms the air, the front chamber moderates it, the ventilation shaft balances it against the outside temperature so nothing overheats. The geese figured out all of this. The geese didn't figure out geothermal activity, Silas said. They just found a warm place. Which amounts to the same thing, Mara said. He conceded this with a tilt of his head. Then he looked at her paper. "What are you thinking about the back chamber eggs?" "I'm thinking we don't touch them," she said. "Not yet. Not until I'm confident those are not active laying sites. The main chamber deposits the old ones. The ones we tested, those are fair to harvest from carefully and in rotation. But the back chamber is the engine of the whole thing. If those hollows are incubation sites and we disturb them, we shut off the engine," Silas said. "We shut off the engine," she confirmed. He thought about that. "How long before you're confident about the back chamber?" 2 more weeks of observation, she said. "I need to watch the laying patterns. Track which birds go back there versus which ones stay in the main chamber. See whether the tunnel birds are the same individuals every time or rotating. You can tell the individual geese apart?" 4 of them, she said. "The one with the darker patches on its neck, I've been calling it ink. There's another one that walks with its right foot turned slightly in. And 2 that are always together, whatever the others do." He looked at her. There was a long pause. "You named one of our geese ink," he said. "I needed a way to track it." "You couldn't track it with a number? A name is easier to remember." He looked like he was going to say something else and then decided not to. Fine. 2 more weeks. But Mara, he stopped and rubbed the back of his neck in the way he did when he was trying to say something he thought she might push back against. The weather isn't going to wait 2 weeks. She knew what he meant. The clouds had been building for 4 days. Every morning, the temperature was lower than the day before by a margin that felt deliberate, intentional, like the cold was announcing itself ahead of its arrival. The old-timers in the valley had been predicting a hard winter since September. She'd heard it in town, heard it from the Vosslers when she'd stopped to trade for wool, heard it in the way people loaded their wagons with more than they usually took. Everyone was preparing for something they couldn't quite see yet, but could feel in the particular quality of the November air, and their provisions were still short. She hadn't stopped knowing this, even while the cave had been filling her attention. She knew it the way you know about a tooth that's starting to ache. It didn't stop being true just because you were thinking about something else. I know the weather isn't waiting, she said, so we work fast. We do the observation in parallel with the systematic harvest from the main chamber deposits. I keep watching and recording. You start building the transport sled. The sled, Silas said, because they talked about this in the abstract, but not the specifics. A narrow sled, she said. Narrow enough to fit through the crack with eggs on it without crushing them. We can't keep carrying them through in a basket around my neck. That's too slow and too uncertain. We need something consistent. Something we can load in here, slide through, unload out there, and slide back empty. A system, he nodded slowly. He was already building it in his mind. She could tell he had a way of going distant when he was mentally constructing something, his eyes slightly unfocused, his hands moving in small gestures at his sides as if feeling for dimensions. Runners need to be smooth, he said almost to himself. Can't have anything that'll catch on the rock. The bed needs to be padded, she said. Cloth, something that won't break the shells. I'll need to measure the crack exactly, he said, coming back to the present. Width at the narrowest point, height, the angle of the floor through the passage. I have the measurements, she said. She handed him the folded paper. He unfolded it and looked at the numbers. Then he looked at the crack in the wall. This is going to be a very small sled, he said. It only needs to hold about 20 eggs at a time, she said. We do multiple trips. And if a runner cracks, if the sled gets stuck halfway through, she hadn't fully worked this out. She thought about it for a moment, standing in the lantern light with the geese moving around their feet. We build 2, she said. Identical. If one fails, we have the other. And we keep the tools close. If the sled gets stuck, we disassemble it in the passage. You want to disassemble a sled inside a crack in a mountain. I want to have a plan for if we have to, she said. There's a difference. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. He picked up the lantern and looked around the main chamber, one more time at the hollows, at the geese, at the ceiling with its mineral darkness, at the water seep running its patient thread down the western wall. All right, he said. I'll start on the sled tomorrow morning. The sled took 4 days to build, which was faster as Mara expected and slower than Silas wanted, and the tension between those two things produced the closest they'd come to a real argument during the entire cave enterprise. Most of its windows were dark. Silas worked on it in the mornings when the light was best and the other chores were done, using the same narrow chisel he'd used on the entrance crack to carve the runners down to the precise width the passage required. He ruined the first pair of runners on the second day, took a fraction too much off one side, and the asymmetry would have made the sled pull left through the narrow passage. And he came in for supper that evening with the set expression of a man who had made a mistake he considers unforgivable and is trying not to show how much it bothers him. Mara didn't make the mistake of saying it was fine. Start the second pair with a smaller chisel, she said instead. Work from the outside in and measure twice between each pass. I know how to measure, he said, with more edge than he probably intended. Then measure more than you think you need to, she said, with less edge than she was feeling, which was the practical version of patience. He looked at her for a moment. I'm not used to things being this tight, he said. This much margin for error. None of us are, she said. That's why we have to be different about this than we've been about other things. He ate supper without saying much else. The next morning, he started the second pair of runners with the smaller chisel and spent an extra hour on each one, measuring at every stage, and they came out right. The sled bed was woven cloth over a light frame, padded with the wool batting they'd bought last spring for a quilt they'd never actually made. The edges were smooth. The whole thing, when assembled, was narrow enough to make Mara feel vaguely claustrophobic just looking at it, which meant it would probably fit. They tested it on a dry run no eggs, just the empty sled on a Thursday afternoon. Mara pulled it through the crack ahead of her, tilted on its side, because the passage wasn't tall enough to slide it through flat, the runners horizontal against the wall, the padded bed against her hip. Scraped. It caught twice on small irregularities she hadn't noticed before. The second catch was bad enough that she had to stop completely, work her hand back along the sled's length, identify the problem, a small knot of wood on the underside of one runner that she'd thought was sanded smooth but wasn't, and work it past the protrusion with a combination of pressure and angle. She came out the other side breathing hard and handed Silas the sled. Not on the left runner, she said, about 8 inches from the back end. He found it without her pointing to it. He ran his thumb over it. He went back to the workbench that afternoon and sanded it down to nothing and ran a piece of tallow candle along the entire length of both runners. And the second test run the following morning went through without catching at all. On Saturday, they did their first real retrieval. Mara counted and loaded 43 eggs from the main chamber's oldest deposits, working slowly and deliberately, choosing from the hollows she'd charcoal marked as non-active, and checking each egg before she placed it in the sled's padded bed. She loaded them in 2 layers, which she'd calculated was the maximum the sled could hold safely while still fitting through the narrowest point of the passage. She arranged them so the heaviest distribution was towards the front, the end, that would come out first, so the balance through the passage would be manageable. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the loaded sled for a long moment. 43 eggs, each one representing a day's nutrition or most of one for a person working through a Wyoming winter. She'd been calculating and recalculating the numbers for 2 weeks now, partly because the numbers themselves were important, and partly because it was her version of reassurance, the thing she did instead of allowing herself to feel relief before she'd earned it. A goose egg was roughly 3 times the caloric weight of a chicken egg. 43 goose eggs, if properly supplemented with the grain and preserved meat they still had in the cabin, could stretch their provisions by weeks, maybe more. And 43 was nowhere near everything the cave held. She pushed the sled toward the passage and got to work. The loaded sleds was harder than the empty sled, heavier, less cooperative, the padded bed flexing slightly when she applied pressure at the wrong angle. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, feeling the runners against the wall with her fingertips as she pulled it, correcting course in tiny increments. Once, near the narrowest point, the sled tilted, and she heard an egg shift, and she stopped breathing for 2 full seconds. She held completely still. She adjusted the angle by a degree, maybe 2. She felt the runners settle back flat. She kept moving. When the front end of the sled emerged into the open air, and Silas's hands closed around it and took the weight, something in Mara's chest unwound, that she hadn't fully realized was wound. She came out behind it. They laid the sled on the flat ground, and Silas started counting. 43 eggs in. 43 eggs out. Every one of them whole. He looked up at her. Well, he said. The same word he'd said when he'd made it through the entrance crack the first time. It was the word he used, she'd come to understand, when something had exceeded what he'd let himself expect. 43, she said. 43, he agreed. She sat down on the cold ground right there, because her legs decided they were done for a moment, and Silas sat down next to her, and they both looked at the eggs, arranged in their padded rows, and neither of them said anything for a while. The geese came out of the mountain at the usual hour, passing around them without particular concern, heading back toward the yard. Ink was in the middle of the line, as usual. The bird with the turned foot was near the back. We should do another retrieval before the weather turns, Mara said. When? Wednesday. Maybe 100 this time, if the main chamber deposits support it. He turned to look at her. You said 40 was what you were comfortable with for the first. For the first retrieval, she said. I've been watching the hollows for 2 weeks now. I know which ones are active and which ones are resting. I know the replacement rate. 100 is inside what the colony can sustain if we give the affected hollows 3 weeks to recover before we go back to them. He held her gaze for a moment. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, she said, which was honest. I'm confident within the limits of what I've been able to observe. There's a difference. People keep telling me there's a difference between things today, he said, but not unkindly. She almost smiled. The Wednesday retrieval brought out 98 eggs. They'd lost 2 in transit. The sled had caught at the knot point. Despite the tallow, which meant Silas needed to make another pass with the sandpaper, and both eggs had cracked on impact with the passage wall. Mara had factored in a breakage rate of roughly 5%, and they'd come in under that, which she noted in the records with a satisfaction she tried not to let become complacency. Their total stored supply, after 2 retrievals, 141 whole eggs. She wrote the number down and looked at it, 141. Silas came up behind her and read the number over her shoulder. 42 more, he said, and we hit 183. She didn't know why that particular number had formed in both their minds as the threshold, something about the arithmetic of it, the way it worked out against their remaining provisions to produce a margin that was no longer just survival, but something adjacent to security. 183 eggs, properly rationed, added to what they still had in the cabin, and the geese's ongoing production in the cave, gave them a winter that was hard but navigable. The 3rd retrieval will do it, she said. But before the 3rd retrieval could happen, the weather changed. It didn't change gradually. The storm that everyone in the valley had been predicting since September arrived not as the slow-building season turn they'd been preparing for, but as something faster and meaner than that, a wall of cold from the north that hit on a Monday night in late November and didn't apologize for any of it. Mara woke at 3 in the morning to a sound she didn't immediately identify, a low continuous roar that took her several seconds to understand as wind of a scale she hadn't experienced before, wind that seemed to have physical weight, pressing on the cabin walls as if testing their opinion of themselves. She sat up. Silas was already awake beside her. "That's bad," he said. His voice was flat and careful, the way his voice got when he was managing his own reaction to something. "How bad?" "Listen to the roof." She listened. Under the roar of the wind, she could hear the cabin roof flexing small sounds, not cracking sounds, but present in a way they hadn't been last week. The temperature inside had dropped noticeably even since she'd woken, which meant the cold was getting into the walls somehow. "The north chinking," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I didn't get to it last week." I know, she hadn't either. They'd been at the cave. She got up and dressed in the dark, and went to the door and opened it. And the cold that came in was not like the cold she was used to. It was immersive. It surrounded her and pressed into every inch of exposed skin simultaneously, and her eyes teared up immediately from the wind. And she understood in that first moment of standing in the doorway, something that took longer to form into words, but was immediately felt that this storm was not a disruption. This was the winter. This was what the old-timers had been talking about. This was the thing that had been building since September, organizing itself with the patience of something that didn't need to hurry. She could see nothing beyond the doorstep. The darkness and the snow and the wind had merged into a single condition. She went back inside and shut the door and stood with her back against it. Silas was lighting the lamp. "The geese," she said. He looked up. "They're in the cave." "I know. But the entrance is a crack in a rock face," he said. "It's been there longer than any of us. It'll hold. The junipers could come down. If the wind is bad enough, Mara." He said her name with a particular intonation that meant stop looking for the next problem for a moment and stay here, one thing at a time. "First we fix the chinking. Then we see what the storm looks like by morning." She made herself stop and think rather than react, which was harder right now than it usually was. He was right that the chinking was the immediate problem. If the cabin lost its thermal seal, they were in genuine danger, not hypothetical danger. She helped him mix the clay straw material they kept stored in the corner for exactly this kind of repair, and they worked on the north wall for 2 hours by lamplight, while the storm said everything it had to say outside. By the time they finished, her hands were stiff, and the lamp oil was lower than she wanted it to be. They sat at the table and looked at each other. "Worst case," Silas said. "Worst case," she agreed. The worst case, as they both understood it, was not this cabin in this storm. The cabin was manageable. The worst case was the valley, the other homesteads scattered across it. The families they knew, and the ones they barely knew, the old and the young and the sick and the ones who were simply unlucky enough to have had a harder season so far than Mara and Silas had. The Vosslers were 2 miles northeast, and old Henrik Vossler had been coughing since October. Nell Harrow was a widow, single, running a half-section alone. Most of its windows were dark, and the last time Mara had seen her in town, she'd had the careful cheerfulness of someone who didn't want to be asked how she was actually doing. The Pritchard brothers, further out, were young and strong, but famously bad at planning ahead and notoriously reluctant to admit it. Mara thought about these people while the storm pressed against the walls. She thought about 141 eggs. She thought about the third retrieval they hadn't done yet, which would put them at 183, which was enough for them, more than enough for 2 people being careful. But 2 people being careful were not the only people in this valley. Silas watched her think. He'd developed a patience for it over the years, the process she went through, which looked from the outside like stillness, but was actually the opposite of stillness, was something he'd learned not to interrupt. When she got quiet like this, in the middle of a crisis, it didn't mean she'd stopped. It meant she was doing the most important part. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere. Outside something, a fence post maybe, or a section of the rail they'd put in last August, gave way with a sound like a single word spoken very loudly in a language you almost recognize. "We're going to have to go out in this," Mara said finally. "I know," Silas said. He didn't argue. He didn't ask her to explain the full reasoning. He'd heard her thinking, in the silence, in the way she was sitting, and he'd arrived at the same place she was arriving. "The third retrieval," she said. "And then," he said, quietly, completing the sentence without the words. She looked at her hands, still stiff from the chinking work. She thought about the weight of the sled loaded with eggs. She thought about 2 miles of drifted snow in the dark and the cold and the wind, with the loaded sled and whatever remained of the trails. She thought about Harlan Briggs saying winter up here has a way of clarifying things. "Yes," she said, "it does." She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but Silas heard it and understood it, because he'd been there on that cold morning at the fence too, 2 steps behind the conversation but present for all of it. "Let's get some sleep," he said. "We move at first light." She looked at the lamp. She thought about the storm outside, the cold, the trails closing under the snow, the hours they had before the drifts became too deep to manage with a loaded sled, the neighbors who didn't know what was sitting in a cave on the other side of the valley. She thought about what it meant to have something and to choose what to do with it. "All right," she said, "first light." The storm did not let up through what remained of the night. She could hear it even in sleep, or the edge of sleeps. She managed the wind working on the cabin with the methodical persistence of something that doesn't know how to stop. She was up before the sky lightened, moving by feel in the dark, dressing in every layer she owned, packing the things they'd need. The number in her head all night had been 141. She knew, even before the third retrieval, what she was going to do with them. The third retrieval almost didn't happen. Mara was up before dawn, as she'd told Silas she would be, moving through the dark cabin by memory because the lamp oil was something she was rationing now alongside everything else. She dressed in the order she'd worked out over the past weeks, underlayer first, then the heavy wool, then the outer coat with the collar that could be pulled up over the chin, then the boots she'd stuffed with extra cloth the night before, to compensate for the fact that the leather had started to separate from the sole on the left one. She'd been meaning to fix that for 2 weeks. She added it to the list she kept in her head of things the cave discovery had pushed aside and that were now reasserting themselves. Silas was up by the time she had the small fire going. He didn't say good morning, neither of them did, usually, until they'd been awake long enough to mean it. He sat atop and pulled on his boots while she heated the leftover grain from last night, and they ate standing up because sitting felt too settled for what they were about to do. The storm had dropped during the night from a roar to a sustained conversation, still present, still cold, but the violence had passed through. Mara cracked the door and looked out. The snow was mid-shin in the yard where it had drifted, knee-high against the north wall of the cabin, and the sky was the particular pre-dawn gray that tells you nothing about whether it plans to get better or worse. "Passable," Silas said, looking over her shoulder. "Barely," she said. "Barely passable is still passable." She closed the door. She looked at the sled, the real one, the transport sled, not the cave sled that Silas had loaded the night before, with the padded crates they'd been building for the past week. Wide, flat-bottomed, with wooden runners that Silas had treated the same way he'd treated the cave sled. designed to be pulled across snow by 2 people or by 1 person and 1 very stubborn mule if necessary. It wasn't elegant. It listed slightly to the left because 1 runner was fractionally longer than the other, and Silas hadn't had time to correct it. But it would hold eggs, Mara said. Bonaparte, Silas confirmed. They hitched the older mule to the transport sled in the gray half-dark, which was a project in itself because Bonaparte had opinions about cold mornings and about projects generally, and he communicated both through a sustained passive resistance that stopped just short of refusal. Silas handled him with the particular patience he reserved for animals and for conversations with difficult neighbors, quiet, steady, not rewarding the obstruction, but not escalating it either. By the time the sky was lightening enough to see clearly, they were moving. The path to the cave was less than a quarter mile, but the snow had made it into a different geography. The markers Mara had set in October, a particular arrangement of stones at the base of the juniper line were buried. She navigated by the shape of the land itself, by the mountain's profile against light and by the direction the wind had been coming from all night, and where it would have built the deepest drifts. She'd grown up reading Sin landscape. The way some people read faces, not as she'd been taught exactly, but as a habit of attention her mother had modeled and that she'd inherited by proximity. They got stuck twice. The first time was where the ground dropped into the shallow swale between the cabin and the mountain's base, and the snowswind, the swale, was thigh-deep in the middle, and they lost the sled's left runner in it and had to dig it out with their hands because they hadn't brought a shovel, which was the kind of oversight that felt obvious in retrospect and always does. The second time was right at the juniper line, where a drift had built against the trees in a way that blocked the path entirely, and Silas took 10 minutes working through it with his boots, while Mara held Bonaparte as steady, talking to the mule in a low, continuous voice about nothing in particular, the way you talk to something nervous. They reached the cave entrance as the sun was making its first serious argument for the day. Mara looked at the crack and felt the warmth and went in. The third retrieval was the most efficient one they'd done. She knew the chamber now, the way she knew the cabin, not just the layout, but the feel of it, the way the air moved, which stones were loose underfoot, which hollows the geese had been at recently, and which had been resting. She moved through it quickly and deliberately, the cave sled loaded with the padded cloth. Most of its windows were dark, and she worked the hollows in the order she'd planned the night before, while the storm was keeping her awake easternmost deposits first, moving west, leaving the hollows nearest the active laying sites completely untouched. She loaded 42 eggs. 42 plus the 141 already at the cabin gave her 183. The number sat in her chest with a weight that was something between satisfaction and responsibility. She'd hit the threshold. She'd done the things she set out to do, and now the threshold felt different than it had when she'd been calculating toward it, because somewhere between the planning and achieving the situation outside had changed, and what had been enough for 2 people being careful was going to become something else before the day was out. She knew this. She'd known it since the lamp was still burning at the table in the dark hours of the storm. She passed the loaded cave sled through the crack and followed it out, and Silas took the eggs and transferred them to the padded crates on the transport sled with the careful focus of a man who understood that what he was handling was not just, but arithmetic, the arithmetic of whether the people in this valley were going to make it through a winter that had just shown them what it was actually capable of. 183, she said. 183, he said back, quietly. Bonaparte shifted his weight and exhaled a long white cloud into the cold air and expressed no opinion about eggs or arithmetic. They were halfway back to the cabin when Mara stopped walking. Silas kept pulling the sled 2 more steps before he noticed and stopped too. He turned to look at her. She was standing in the snow with her hands at her sides and her face turned slightly toward the northeast, where the Vossler homestead was, though you couldn't see it from here. It was past the ridge, past the tree line, 2 miles of this snow between where she stood and where they were. Mara, Silas said. Henrik was coughing in October, she said. I know. Nell Harrow lives alone. I know. The Pritchard boys. Mara. He said it gently, but with the firmness of a man who knows the conversation that's coming and has already decided where he stands on it. I know. I've been thinking about it too. She looked at him. We have 183 eggs, and we need maybe 60 to get the 2 of us to spring, he said. maybe less, with the ongoing production and what's still in the cabin. So we have 120 to spare, she said. Roughly. Roughly, he agreed. She turned her face back toward the northeast. The wind was coming from the north, and it had an edge to it that said the storm hadn't fully finished what it came to do. There was more behind it, stacked up in the invisible north, and it would be arriving on its own schedule. We go to the Vosslers first, she said. Then Nell. Then the Pritchards. That's 6 miles round trip, Silas said. In this snow. With a loaded sled, I know what it is. It could take all day. I know that too. He stood in the snow looking at her for a moment. She watched him run the numbers the same way she'd been running them provisions. Distance, weather window, physical capacity. He was a practical man. He'd arrived at the same answer. She had not because practicality demanded it, but because he was also the man who'd reached for her hand in the dark when she was lying awake worrying, and those two things were not separate things in him. We take the sled back to the cabin first, he said. Store the eggs. Pack the crates separately for travel. Then we go. We don't have time to 20 minutes, he said. We drop the eggs, we reorganize. We tell the mule what's expected of him. 20 minutes. She thought about whether 20 minutes mattered. She thought about the sky and the wind and the distance to the Vosslers. 15, she said. 15, he agreed. They were back out of the cabin in 14 minutes and a half, which she noted but didn't say, because Silas was already aware of it, and pointing it out would have been the kind of small victory that costs more than it's worth. The route to the Vosslers was a trail Mara had walked in better conditions maybe 8 times since spring, not enough to know it truly by heart, but enough to know its general argument northeast along the valley floor, following the creek line where the willows marked the water even under snow, then up a gentle rise to where the Vossler land began. In good conditions, it was a 40-minute walk. In these conditions, pulling a sled, it was whatever it turned out to be. It turned out to be 90 minutes. She and Silas didn't talk much during it. There was a particular quality to moving through hard conditions together where conversation becomes something you save not because you're angry or distant, but because all the available energy is going toward the same place, and words feel like a withdrawal from a bank account that's already running narrow. They moved, and they stopped when they needed to, and they moved again. Bonaparte was actually better in the snow than he was in a barn, which was one of the recurring mysteries of his personality. He pulled without ceremony and complained without stopping. The Vossler cabin announced itself as a smear of wood smoke against the gray sky about 20 minutes before they reached it. Mara saw it and felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized was tight. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone inside with the means to keep it going. That was the most important news the landscape could offer right now, and she took it without letting herself feel too much relief, too fast. Old Henrik Vossler opened the door before they reached the porch. He was a big man, reduced by time and illness, still broad through the shoulders, but with a hollowness around his eyes that hadn't been there in September. He was wrapped in a blanket over his coat, and his wife Berta was visible behind him, and they both looked at Mara and Silas and the loaded sled with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, more like the expression of people who have been trying not to think about something and have just been given permission to think about it. Ellsworth's, Henrik said. His voice had a catch in it that was the cough waiting. Morning, Henrik, Mara said. She kept her voice even and practical because the Vosslers were proud people, the way most people who had survived real hardship were proud, and the wrong tone could close a door faster than a storm could. We've got more eggs than 2 people can manage. The geese have been productive. She kept it vague because she decided on the walk here that the cave wasn't something she was ready to explain yet. Just eggs, just abundance, briefly described. Henrik looked at the crate Silas was lifting from the sled. That's a lot of eggs, he said carefully. 30 of them are yours, Mara said, if you want them. If he stopped, he looked at his wife. Something passed between them that Mara didn't try to read. We're not taking charity, he said, but his voice had lost the certainty that sentence usually requires. It's not charity, Mara said. It's eggs. The valley feeds itself by feeding each other when one person's got more than they need. That's been the deal since before either of us got here. She paused. Henrik, how long has the cough been this bad? His jaw tightened. It's fine. It's not fine, Berta said from behind him, with the particular directness of a woman who has been watching her husband's minimize something for too long. He hasn't slept through the night in 3 weeks. I need him rested and eating, Mara said, still to Henrik, because she understood the game and knew that Berta's backing actually made it easier to let Henrik receive without losing face. It's all. 30 eggs, some protein, some rest. He helps me by getting better. There was a pause. Henrik looked at the crate. He was the kind of man who needed to construct a logic around accepting something before he could accept it, and she'd given him one. And she watched him use it. 30, said finally. 30, she confirmed. They stayed 20 minutes long enough to make sure the fire was drawing properly, which it wasn't. There was a damper issue that Silas fixed in 10 minutes with a stick and a piece of wire while Mara sat with Berta and drank the weak coffee she was offered, and listened to the older woman talk about the winter without saying what she was most afraid of, which was the cough and where coughs like that went if they weren't managed. Maras listened and didn't offer false comfort and didn't minimize and didn't fill the silences with noise, which was sometimes the most useful thing you could do for a person. When they left, Berta pressed Mara's hands and didn't say anything, and Mara nodded, and that was enough. The trail to Nell Harrow's place went southeast from the Vosslers and then west, which put them into the wind for most of it. Mara pulled her collar up and tucked her chin and kept moving. Silas was on the other side of the sled's pull rope, and he matched her pace without discussion. Bonaparte had stopped complaining and entered what appeared to be a philosophical acceptance of his circumstances. Nell Harrow's homestead was smaller than the Vosslers' a single cabin, well-maintained in the way that single people's spaces sometimes are, every resource visible and accounted for. The woodpile was lower than it should have been for this point in November. Mara noted this without showing that she'd noted it. Nell herself was a woman around 50, small and capable, with quick eyes and the perpetual slight squint of someone who spent a lot of time calculating odds. She'd lost her husband 3 years ago, fever, fast and unexpected, and she'd stayed on in the valley. Because leaving would have meant admitting that the life she'd built here couldn't hold her, and Nell Harrow was not a woman who made admissions like that easily. She opened her door and looked at Mara and Silas and the sled, and her expression was more guarded than Henrik's had been. Less willingness to be seen needing something. More armor. "You're out in this for a social call?" she said. "The geese overproduced," Mara said, using the same line because it had worked, and because she'd found something that worked, and she wasn't going to fix it. "We've got more eggs than we know what to do with. Thought you might take some off our hands." Nell looked at the sled. She looked at Mara. "How many eggs does a goose lay in November?" She was sharper than Henrik, was the thing. Nell had always been sharper, which was maybe why her armor was heavier when you saw things clearly. You understood more precisely how exposed you were. Mara met her eyes. "A lot," she said, "when they find the right place to do it." A pause. Nell's eyes stayed on hers. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. "I found something," Mara confirmed. "And when I understand it well enough to share it properly, I will. Right now I'm just asking if you want 25 eggs." Another pause. Longer this time. Nell looked past Mara at Silas, who gave a small honest nod that confirmed nothing except that he was aligned with his wife on this, which was apparently what Nell needed. "Come in out of the cold," Nell said. "Coffee's on." The coffee was real coffee, which told Mara something about Nell's priorities and provoked a small, entirely private feeling of warmth. They sat for 30 minutes, while the wind worked on the cabin walls with the same persistent attention it had been giving everything else. And Nell talked about the woodpile, yes. It was lower than she wanted. She'd had a problem with the splitting maul in October and lost 2 weeks of cutting. And Mara listened, and Silas asked 2 practical questions about the maul and determined that it was a handle issue, not a head issue, and told her what she'd need from the hardware in town when the snow cleared. When they left, Nell walked them to the edge of her porch and said, "Mara." And when Mara turned, "Whatever you found, take care of it." "I plan to," Mara said. The Pritchard brothers were the longest haul, almost a mile further west, and the snow had drifted differently on that stretch of the valley, deeper in the open areas between the tree lines, and they had to stop twice to rest Bonaparte and once to dig out the sled runner that had caught on something buried. By the time they saw the Pritch cabin, Mara's legs felt like they'd been replaced with something heavier than legs. And her face had been so cold for so long that it had moved past hurting into the numb territory that she knew she needed to keep an eye on. She said nothing about any of this. Silas glanced at her once, reading her, and said nothing either, not dismissively, but because he understood that naming it wouldn't help, and that she knew her own limits well enough. This was the particular respect they had for each other. Not the kind that protected you from difficulty, but the kind that trusted you to be the authority on your own capacity. The Pritchard brothers were exactly what the Valley had always said. They were young, strong, underprepared, and genuinely not fully aware of how underprepared they were. Cal, the older one, was 26, and his younger brother Denny was 23, and they'd come out west with the specific confidence of men who'd worked hard their whole lives and believed that hard work was sufficient preparation for anything. It was not an unreasonable belief. It was also not an entirely correct one. Cal opened the door, and the smell of the inside of the cabin hit Mara immediately, not a bad smell exactly. Most of its windows were dark, but the smell of a space where two young men had been living without much variety in their food for too long, and where the particular odor of boiled grain had worked its way into the walls and the curtains and everything else. "Mrs. Ellsworth," Cal said, with the slightly surprised intonation of a man who'd not fully expected company this morning, and was deciding whether he was glad about it or not. "Silas, you came out in this?" "We were in the area," Silas said, which was almost entirely false, but said with sufficient straightness that Cal accepted it. Denny appeared behind his brother, younger looking than his age, with the look of someone who hadn't slept well in several nights. He saw the sled, and his eyes went to it, and then away, the way hungry people's eyes go to food when they're trying not to be seen looking. That look hit Mara somewhere that she didn't let show on her face. "We've got eggs," she said simply, "more than we need. Thought we'd bring some over before the next round of weather hits." There was a much briefer negotiation here than with the Vosslers and Nell, partly because the Pritchards were young enough that pride hadn't yet fully hardened into the kind of armor that was genuinely difficult to get through, and partly because Denny, the younger one, said yes. Please, before Cal had the chance to go through the social ritual of refusing first. Cal gave his brother a look that could have meant several things and then said, "We appreciate it," and that was that. Mara gave them 30 eggs. She also, without making anything of it, looked at the woodpile situation while Cal was opening the crate, and then she looked at Silas, and Silas understood. He spent 15 minutes with the splitting maul he found in the shed, out back, working through a pile of unsplit rounds that the brothers hadn't gotten to, while Mara sat inside with the two young men and asked Cal about his plans for the spring, not because she was particularly interested in his spring plans right now, but because she understood that people needed to feel forward-looking when we're in the middle of difficulty, needed to have something beyond the current thing to talk about. Cal had plans for the spring. He talked about them. Some of them were good plans, and some of them were the kind of plans that needed more reality testing than she was going to provide today. And she listened to all of them with the same genuine attention. When Silas came back from the woodpile, he had the look of a man who has moved his body usefully and feels better for it. Most of its windows were dark. He brushed the wood chips off his coat and didn't mention the woodpile, and Mara didn't mention it either. And the Pritchard brothers thanked them for the eggs and the visit and saw them to the door. "You need anything else?" Mara said at the door. "You know where we are." Denny said, "Same to you," and meant it. She could hear it in how he said it, the genuine reciprocity of someone who'd just been given something and wanted very much to be in a position to give something back someday. That mattered to her. She'd been careful not to make this delivery feel like a one-direction thing, and that carefulness had worked, which was itself a kind of relief. They left the Pritchard place in the early afternoon, with the sled empty of delivery eggs in a sky that had shifted from gray to the particular yellowy white that meant more snow was thinking about it seriously. Bonaparte had graduated from philosophical acceptance into what appeared to be resigned determination, which was, in some ways, his best mode. Mara walked beside the sled on the return trip and let her body do the mechanical work while her mind ran through the accounting. 30 eggs to the Vosslers, 25 to Nell, 30 to the Pritchards, 85 total distributed. That left them with 98 from the morning's total, plus whatever the ongoing cave production was adding, plus what they still had in the cabin. The margin was thinner now, but still there, And it was the right kind of thin, the kind that came from a decision she'd made with full awareness, rather than from a miscalculation. She thought about Henrik's hollowed eyes, about Nell's careful face when she said take care of it, about Denny Pritchard looking at the crate and looking away. She thought about what it meant to have seen something that others hadn't, and what you did with that. The valley was quiet in the snow. The wind had dropped to a murmur. The light had gone flat and white, and the dark shapes of the other homesteads were just barely visible as smudges against the landscape at intervals, smoke columns marking them. She could see maybe half a dozen from where she was on the valley floor, maybe more. Families in each one, doing the arithmetic, wondering about the weather, hoping their provisions would hold. She thought about what would happen if this winter was as bad as it looked like it was going to be. She thought about the cave. Most of its windows were dark, sitting the mountain with its stable air and its warm eastern wall and its hundreds of eggs sitting in their naturally worn hollows, patient and whole. The geese crossing the meadow each evening to go inside and lay more and come back out again in the morning. She thought about how much the cave could hold. Not just eggs. The thought had been at the edge of her mind since she'd discovered the second chamber, the one with the warm floor, a thought that was bigger than the immediate problem of getting through to this winter. That was about what came after, about what a place like that could mean not just for two people trying to survive, but for an entire community, trying to do the same thing over and over, year after year, in a place that made no promises about kindness. She hadn't fully formed it yet. She needed to understand the cave better, first needed more time, more observations, more confidence in the sustainability of what they were doing. She couldn't share something she didn't fully understand, but the thought was there. It had the particular quality of thoughts that aren't going away. Silas was pulling the sled ahead of her, and she watched his back for a moment, the familiar set of his shoulders. The way he moved in the snow, the slight lean he'd developed from years of working surfaces that weren't level. Silas, she said. He looked back without stopping. Yeah, in the spring, she said, we're going to need to have a conversation with the valley. He was quiet for a couple of steps. About the cave. About the cave, she confirmed. He nodded and turned back to the path ahead. All right, he said. Spring. They came back into the yard as the light was starting to fail. The cabin windows were dark. Neither of them had thought to leave a lamp burning, which was the kind of small thing that piled up on you at the end of a long day. The north wall of the cabin was holding. Bonaparte went back to his usual post-work mode of aggressive indifference and was unmoved by their return in a way that was almost comforting. Mara went inside and lit the lamp and looked at the eggs remaining in their padded crates, counted them, wrote the number down. She added the notes about the retrieval and the deliveries in the journal she'd been keeping since the cave discovery, not just the numbers, but the observations, the details, the things she didn't want to lose track of in the coming months. 98 eggs. Storm ongoing. 3 families supplied. She held the pen over the page for a moment. Silas came in and shed his coat and stood by the fire, and after a while he said, "You're not going to write the hard part down." "What hard part?" "The part where you were up at 3 in the morning listening to the storm and deciding to give away more than half of what we'd worked for." She put the pen down. "That's not the hard part," she said. "The hard part was before that. The hard part was finding it and then sitting on it long enough to understand it before doing anything." He thought about that. "Fair," he said. Outside, the second wave of the storm arrived quietly, not the roar of the first night, but a steady, committed snowfall that came down in the windless dark, in the particular dense way that meant it wasn't stopping for a while. Mara went to the door and opened it, and looked out for a moment at the white darkness, the snow coming down through the lamplight, at the edge of the porch, the mountain's shape invisible now behind the weather. Somewhere inside it, warm and dry, 40 geese were settled on the stone floor of a chamber that no one in the valley knew existed, except for 2 tired, cold, very deliberate people who had spent the last 3 weeks learning how to be responsible for something extraordinary. She stood there long enough to let the cold remind her of what the day had felt like. Then she went back inside. She picked up the pen. She added one more line to the journal entry. "Valley doesn't know yet what it has. Our job right now is to make sure we don't lose it before they can." She closed the journal. She meant to go to sleep and instead lay awake for an hour thinking about spring and about what you said to a valley full of people who'd spent all winter doubting you, and how you said it, so that what came after was something everyone could use, and not something anyone could ruin. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had more than she'd had in November. Winter did what winter does. It stayed longer than anyone wanted it to, and left less gracefully than anyone hoped, the way hard things generally do. February brought a brief thaw that raised everyone's spirits too early, and then a third hard freeze that knocked them back down, and March arrived gray and unconvincing, and it wasn't until the last week of March that the snow in the valley floor started pulling back from the fence lines in a way that looked permanent rather than provisional. Mara had kept the journal through all of it. She had entries from every week: egg counts, retrieval records, colony observations, temperature notes she'd taken by feel, since she had no instrument more precise than her own hand held against the cave wall. She had entries about the geese, individual notes on the birds she'd been tracking since November. Ink had laid 31 eggs that Mara had tallied across the winter, which was more than she'd expected from a single bird in cold months, and told her something about what the second chamber's warmth was doing for the colony's production cycle. The turned-foot bird she'd started calling, Crooked, had been injured. At some point in January, she'd noticed the altered gait, more pronounced, and the bird had spent 4 days in the main chamber, without going to the tunnel, which had alarmed her more than she'd admitted to Silas. Then, on the 5th day, Crooked had rejoined the tunnel group, and Mara had felt a relief disproportionate to the situation, that she'd actually laughed at herself in the cave, alone, with no one to hear it. That was the thing about the geese. She hadn't expected to start caring about them as individuals. She'd started watching them for data, and somewhere along the way, the data had acquired names, and the names had acquired histories. And now she had 40 birds she actually worried about, which was not something she'd have predicted about herself 6 months ago. 6 months ago. The journal also had entries that had nothing to do with the cave. An entry from the second week of January, when Hendrik Vossler's cough had gotten bad enough that Bertus had sent word asking if anyone knew a remedy, and Mara had gone over with what she had: some dried herbs her mother had pressed on her before they left Missouri. The kind of thing she'd packed without fully expecting to use, more out of habit than belief. She'd sat with Berta for an afternoon and listened, and she'd left the herbs and instructions for the tea, and she'd walked home in the cold, not knowing whether it would help, and carrying that not knowing the whole way back. Henrik had improved by the end of January. She didn't know if the tea had anything to do with it. She'd written in the journal, Henrik better. Maybe the herbs. Maybe just time. Don't know. Glad either way. There was an entry from February about Nell Harrow, who had knocked on their door one afternoon unannounced, which was a 6-mile round trip in conditions that were still difficult, and who had brought a jar of preserved plums she'd put up in August, and said simply, "For what you brought in November," and left again before Mara had fully processed what to say. Mara had written that entry twice: the first version too long, too full of what she was feeling, and the second version just the facts, and a single line at the end: "She came 6 miles in the snow to give us plums." Some things don't need explanation. There was an entry about Harlan Briggs that she'd written, and then crossed through almost entirely, leaving only, "He sent a man over with a message asking again about the land." Silas sent a message back. Subject closed, and there were entries, running through all the other entries like a thread, about what she was going to say when spring came. Not scripts, she didn't work that way, but thoughts, questions she needed to answer for herself before she could answer them for anyone else. What the cave could sustainably provide. What rules would need to be in place for it to keep working. How to explain what she'd found in a way that made people understand the responsibility that came with it, not just the resource. Most of its windows were dark. How to tell a valley full of people who'd spent a winter doubting her that she had something they all needed, and not have it come out as the thing it wasn't. Because the wrong version of that conversation was its own kind of danger. Thought about this a lot. The wrong version was the one where she stood in front of her neighbors with a discovery that had kept them alive, and let it become about being right. About the look on Harlan's face, about the quiet satisfaction of having been underestimated and then proven correct. She understood the pull of that version. She wasn't going to pretend she didn't. But the pull was the problem, not the solution, and she'd spent enough cold evenings at the table being honest with herself about the difference. The cave wasn't hers. That was the core of it. She'd found it. She'd understood it. She'd protected it through a winter when carelessness could have destroyed what it was. But the mountain had been there before her, and the geese had found it years before either she or Silas had arrived in the valley. What she'd done was steward something, and a steward's job was to eventually open the gate. She was dark. She was thinking about all of this on the first genuinely warm morning of April, standing at the fence watching the geese cross the meadow toward the mountain in their evening line, when Silas came up behind her and stood next to her without saying anything for a while. "It's time," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "You've been ready for 2 weeks," he said. "You're just working up to it." She considered denying this and decided not to. "I'm thinking about how to do it right. There's no perfect version of this," he said, not unkindly. "You know that. I know that. So you're going to stand here at this fence until you find one anyway?" She looked at him. He had that expression she'd learned over the years, the one that was simultaneously exasperated and fond, which was maybe the expression that best described their marriage in its entirety. He pushed her when she needed pushing, which was not often, but he knew the difference between when she was thinking and when she was delaying, which was a distinction most people didn't bother to make. "Sunday," she said. "We invite them Sunday, all of them?" She thought about the list. The Vosslers, Nell, the Pritchard brothers, the 2 homesteads further out that she knew less well, the Fenner family, a couple with 3 young children who'd arrived in the valley in August, with more optimism than supplies, an old man Castile, a widower in his 60s who kept to himself in a way that might have been preference or might have been something harder. She thought about whether Harlan Briggs went on the list. "All of them," she said, "including Harlan." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That's a decision." "It is," she said. "But if I leave him out, and then whatever we do with the cave becomes something the valley knows about and values, he finds out eventually, and he finds out he was excluded, and then we have a different problem. I'd rather have him in the rooms where I can see what he does with it. And if he tries to take it, he can't take a mountain," she said. "And after Sunday, there'll be too many people who know about it for any one person to claim it." She looked at the geese disappearing into the juniper shadow. "That's the whole point." They sent word the next morning, Silas writing out with messages, Mara writing them the night before in her clearest hand, which was not particularly clear, but was legible enough. The message said simply, "We have something we'd like to show you. Sunday noon at our place first, and then the mountain. Bring a candle if you have one to spare." She debated the last line and kept it because it was specific, and specific things told people this was real. The response from the Vosslers came back the same day. Berta had sent a note in Henrik's hand, which told her the cough was better, which told her more than the note itself said. Yes, they would come. Nell sent no note but appeared at the cabin door on Friday morning, saying she'd be there Sunday, and asking if she should bring anything. Mara said no, and then said actually if she had any rope to spare. Nell said she had rope and would bring it, and left without explaining why she'd wanted to know if she should bring something, which was just Nell. The Pritchards sent Cal, who rode over in person and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and said he didn't want to speak for his brother, but he'd be there, and he thought Denny would too. And he wanted to say, before Sunday, that what she and Silas had done in November was something neither of them had forgotten. Mara said she appreciated that and didn't elaborate, and Cal nodded and left. Harlan Briggs sent no response at all for 3 days, which was its own kind of response. On Saturday evening, the day before, Silas came in from the barn and said he'd seen one of Harlan's hired hands on the North Trail, moving toward their place and then turning back when he saw Silas watching. "He's deciding," Mara said, "whether to come. Whether to come, and if he comes, who to be when he does." She stirred the pot on the stove. "He'll come. He's too curious not to, and too afraid of being left out," Silas said. "That too," she said. The Fenners arrived first on Sunday, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought they might be the most uncertain about the invitation, given that they knew her the least. But it was barely past 11 when she saw them coming across the valley in a small group. The husband and wife and the 3 children strung out behind them like ducklings. And the sight of the 3 children made something in her chest do something she hadn't planned for. She'd been so focused on the adults, on the conversation she needed to have, on the logistic and the politics and the careful question of how you share something fragile with people who don't yet understand why it's fragile. And so she hadn't thought about the children. She thought about them now. 3 kids in a valley that had nearly had a winter it couldn't manage, in a place that would have more winters like this one before any of them were grown. She thought about what it would mean for children to grow up, knowing the cave was there, to grow up with the habit of thinking about the land the way the cave required you to think about it, not as something to extract from, but as something to tend. She went out to meet them. The Fenner wife Louisa, young, maybe 23, with the competent hands of someone who'd been working since she could walk, shook Mara's hands and said they were glad to come. The husband, Thomas, shook Silas's hand and looked at the mountain the way people sometimes looked at the mountain, like it was simply scenery, which of course it had been until it wasn't. The Vosslers arrived next, Henrik moving slowly but upright, Berta close at his side, without touching him, in a way that told Mara she was ready to catch him if needed without letting him know she was. He looked better than January. Not well, but better. And that was what mattered. Nell came alone, with the rope she'd promised over her shoulder, which made her look like she was prepared for anything, and probably was. Pritchards came together, Cal and Denny, both of them clean-shaved, which told Mara they'd treated this like an occasion, which moved her in a way she hadn't expected. Old Man Castile came on, a horse that looked as old as he did, and dismounted with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew his body's terms and had made peace with them. He said nothing to anyone, just stood to one side and watched with sharp eyes and waited. Harlan Briggs arrived last. He rode up on the black horse, the same horse from that morning at the fence, and he dismounted this time. He tied the horse at the post and walked toward the ground but nodded at Silas, and then looked at Mara, and the look was different from the look in November. Not warmer, exactly, but different. The look of a man who has spent a winter wondering about something and isn't certain what he's about to find out. Ellsworth, he said to her. Not Pastor Briggs, she said. Glad you came. He said nothing to this, which was fine. She didn't need him to say anything to it. Mara looked at the group in Simsel Yard, 11 people, including the 3 Fenner children, in the April morning light with the mountain behind them and the geese moving in the meadow ahead of them, which had not been planned but which felt right in a way that planned things rarely did. She hadn't prepared a speech. She'd thought about it and decided against it, because speeches put you on a stage and she didn't want a stage. She wanted a conversation. Most of you got eggs from us in November, she said. Her voice was even, and she kept it at a normal conversational volume, which meant the group had to come in slightly, which was what she wanted people pay attention differently when they have to lean in. And I told you the geese overproduced. That wasn't exactly the full truth. She paused. What actually happened was that our geese led us to something, and I needed to understand it before I could share it. I think I understand it well enough now. She looked at Henrik, at Nell, at the Pritchard boys, at the Fenner children, who were watching her with the absolute full attention that children give to things when they sense the adults around them think it matters. There's a cave in that mountain, she said. The geese found it before we did. It has properties natural ones. Temperature, ventilation. Something thermal under the floor in the back that make it one of the best natural storage spaces I've ever encountered. We've been using it all winter. The eggs you got in November came from it. She stopped for a moment. It has the capacity to do much more than that, but only if we use it correctly. And correctly is the word that matters. She watched the group take this in. She watched Harlan Briggs's face go through several things in rapid succession and then settle into stillness, which was its own kind of tell. Old Man Castile spoke first, which surprised her. How big, he said. The main chamber is 60 feet across. Maybe more, she said. There's a second chamber, beyond a tunnel smaller, warmer. Between the two, there's enough space to store a significant amount of provisions for the entire valley. Not just eggs, grain, preserved vegetables, anything that needs stable, cool storage. And you've been using it all winter, Harlan said. His voice was flat, unreadable. Just the 2 of you. Managing it, Mara said. There's a difference. We've been doing the work of understanding it and protecting the colony that makes it functional. That's not the same as claiming it. Then who does it belong to? He said. The questions were dark. The question was direct, and she'd been expecting it, and she'd thought about how to answer it for 3 months. The mountain belongs to itself, she said. Same as it always has. What I'm proposing is that the valley decides together how to use it and what rules govern that use, because the only way it keeps working is if everyone follows the same rules. And the only way everyone follows the rules is if everyone helped make them. There was a silence. The wind moved through the grass in the meadow. One of the Fenner children, the youngest, tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something, and Louisa saw Fenner whispered back without looking down. "What are your rules?" Nell said. "The ones you've been using." "4 of them," Mara said. "No harvesting from active nesting areas ever. Only sustainable surplus gets collected. I've been tracking the colony's replacement rate all winter, and I know what that number is. Every withdrawal gets recorded, by who and how much. And there's always an emergency reserve that nobody touches unless the valley genuinely needs it, and that decision gets made together, not by one person." "Who keeps the records?" Henrik said. "Whoever the valley decides," she said. "It doesn't have to be me. It probably shouldn't be just me." Harlan was quiet through this. He was looking at the mountain. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, which was unusual. He was generally the kind of man whose thoughts arrived on his face before he'd fully decided to show them. Whatever was happening in him right now was happening deeper than usual. "You could have kept this to yourselves," he said finally. He wasn't looking at her. He was still looking at the mountain, all of it. "Yes," she said. "You could have had it as a private advantage. All winter and into next year and the year after." "Yes," she said again. He turned to look at her then. "Why didn't you?" It was a genuine question. She could hear that. Not a challenge, not a political maneuver. A genuine question from a man who would have made the other choice and was trying to understand someone who hadn't. "Because a valley isn't a private advantage," she said. "A valley is where you live with other people, and what happens to them eventually happens to you, one way or another." The winter proved that. Harlan held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in his face that she didn't try to name. "Show us the cave," he said. She walked them to the mountain. The approach through the meadow was different with 11 people than it had ever been. With 2 noisier, slower, the children running ahead and then circling back. Castile's horse left tied at the fence, the group spreading out through the juniper shadow and then clustering when they saw the crack in the rock. She heard the intake of breath from Louisa Fenner. She heard Castile say something quiet to himself that wasn't meant for anyone else. Mara stood at the entrance and let them look. "It's small," Cal Pritchard said, not critically, just stating it. "The entrance is small," she said. "What's behind it isn't." She held her candle near the crack and the warm air pulled the flame toward it. "You feel that?" Several hands went forward tentatively into the edge of the opening. She watched their faces. When the warmth hit them, the small involuntary widening of the eyes that people do, when something physical contradicts what they expected. It never got old, watching people feel the warmth come out of a mountain in April. She went through first, as she always did, and Silas went last, as he always did, and in between them the others navigated the passage with varying degrees of difficulty. Nell went through with the self-contained efficiency she applied to everything. Henrik needed help from Berta and from Silas's hands guiding him on the inside, but he made it. Harlan Briggs went through the crack in the stone with his jaw set and his pride held carefully in check, and emerged into the main chamber with dirt on his coat and didn't mention it. The children went through like water. Inside, Mara lit the lantern she'd left, mounted on a stone ledge she'd built in October, and the chamber opened up, in the way it always did, in the stronger light, larger than the entrance had suggested, the ceiling higher, the walls going further. The geese were not inside at this hour, which she'd known they wouldn't be, but the evidence of them was everywhere: the feathers, the worn paths between the hollow clusters, the particular smell of a space that living things had inhabited for a long time. She let the group stand in silence for a moment and look. This was the part she'd thought about most carefully. There was a version of this where she walked them through everything. Immediately, the second chamber, the ventilation shaft, the full egg count, the data she'd been collecting for 5 months. All of it. She could show them the journal. She could demonstrate the sled system. She could give them the complete picture in one presentation. But she decided against that version because it made her the authority in a way that the cave itself was the authority. Better to let the cave do the work. Better to let people stand in the warmth and the dark and arrive at their own understanding. So she let them stand. She held the lantern and she watched their faces. Louisa Fenner was crying quietly, which she seemed to be trying not to do, and Mara understood it. The release of something that had been held through a very hard winter was not always dignified, and that was fine. Her husband had his arm around her without making it conspicuous. Henrik Vossler was looking at the hollows along the wall, moving toward them slowly, and Burton stayed close to him. He reached one and crouched down, which cost him something physically, and looked at the eggs in it, and stayed crouched for a longer time than his knees probably wanted. When he straightened up, he looked at Mara across the chamber, and his face said something that his voice couldn't have managed right then. Denny Pritchard said, "There must be 100 eggs in here." And Cal said quietly, "More?" And Denny said, "How many more?" And Mara said, "Let me show you." She took them through the tunnel. The tunnel was harder for the group than the main chamber, lower ceiling, single file. The older members slower. But they all made it, Castile last, and they came out into the second chamber and felt the floor warmth. And this time, there were multiple inhales, and someone said something Mara didn't catch, and one of the Fenner children, the middle one, a girl of maybe 7, sat down on the warm floor with a thump and pressed both palms flat against it and said, "Mama, the ground is warm," in a voice full of the specific wonder that children have for things that don't follow the rules they've been taught. Mara felt that in her chest. She was going to remember that for a long time. After the second chamber, they came back through to the main, and people sat or stood where they found space, and the conversation that happened next was not orderly and was not entirely civil and went on for nearly 2 hours, which was exactly how long it needed to go on. Harlan was the difficult part, as she'd known he would be. Not hostile. She had the sense that he'd done something during this winter. Privately, some kind of reckoning that had moved him off the position he'd been in when he'd sat on that horse and laughed at her. But old habits of thought were present, and he asked pointed questions about access and governance, and who would ultimately have authority over what happened inside the mountain. And some of the questions were the questions of a man trying to find leverage. And some of them were the questions of a man who genuinely wanted to understand how something complicated would work. She answered all of them the same way, without making distinctions between the motive behind them, because the answers were the same regardless. No one person has authority, she said for the third time, to a variation of the same question. That's the design. It requires everyone to agree, which means it requires everyone to be in the conversation. And if someone breaks the rules, Harlan said, then the rest of us decide what to do about it, Mara said. Together, he held her gaze for a moment. And you trust that to work? More than I trust one person deciding everything, she said, including me. Something changed in his expression when she said that last part. She thought it was the admission that she'd included herself in the constraint, that she wasn't standing outside the rules she was proposing, and that it had surprised him. She thought he'd expected her to claim an exception for herself as the discoverer, as the one who'd done the work, and she hadn't. He looked at the floor of the cave for a moment. He looked at the walls. 4 rules, he said finally. You said 4 rules. 4 to start, she said. If we need more, we make more. Together. He nodded once. Not agreement exactly, more like the acknowledgement that there was nothing left in this line of questioning that was going to get him somewhere different. It was Castile who settled it, in the end, in the way that old men sometimes settle things by saying the thing everyone is working around in a voice that makes it sound like common sense, so obvious it barely needed saying. He'd been quiet for most of the 2 hours, standing slightly apart with his arms folded, watching. When he spoke, everyone turned because it was the first time he'd spoken since he'd asked how big it was, back in the yard. Woman found something, he said. Took care of it all winter. Fed people who needed feeding. Now she's offering to share the whole thing along with the rules that'll keep it working. He paused. Only question I've got is why we're talking about it, instead of shaking her hand. A silence. And then Henrik Vossler made a sound that was part laugh and part something older than a laugh, and Berta took his arm, and Nell crossed the cave in about 5 steps and shook Mara's hand with both of hers and held it for a moment, and the Pritchard brothers nodded in the way young men nod, when they're feeling more than they're going to say. And Louisa Fenner wiped her face and took her daughter's hand, and Castile himself gave a single firm nod and looked satisfied in the way of someone whose job here was done. Harlan Briggs waited until most of the others had moved before he crossed to where Mara was standing. He stopped in front of her. He was a big man, and she was a heavy woman, and they were about the same height, and he looked at her at eye level. For maybe the first time, not down, not past her. I said something to you in November, he said. You did, she said. I was out of line. She looked at him. She thought about several things she could say, and chose the one that served the situation rather than the one that satisfied the feeling. I appreciate that, she said. He put out his hand. She shook it. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't friendship, and neither of them was confused about what it was. It was two people in a valley deciding that they could work with each other, which was sometimes the most you got, and was, in its way, enough. In the weeks that followed, Silas worked on the entrance, widening it carefully, so carefully, it took 3 weeks to do what a man with no patience would have attempted in 3 days. He followed the fracture lines, removed only what could be removed, without disturbing the supporting structure, and tested the stability at every stage. By the end of May, the entrance was wide enough for Henrik Vossler to get through without assistance, and for Castile, and for a loaded sled twice the size of the original one. Mara taught the record-keeping system to Nell Harrow, who turned out to have a natural aptitude for it that was almost irritating in how much better she was at it than Mara had been. Nell's records were meticulous in a way that made Mara's look like rough drafts, which they were, and she said so, and Nell said the underlying observations were what mattered. The data was Mara's. She was just organizing it, and that was true enough that Mara accepted it. The rotating harvest system was established by the end of May. Active nesting areas were mapped and marked. Mara's original charcoal marks replaced by carved stone indicators that Silas and Cal Pritchard worked on together over several afternoons. Emergency reserves were designated in the coolest section of the main chamber and agreed upon by the group in a meeting that took longer than it should have, because Thomas Fenner had a question about the reserve threshold that turned out to be most of its windows were dark. Better question than anyone initially thought, and the number they ended up agreeing on was different from and more defensible than the number Mara had started with. This was the thing she hadn't fully anticipated. That involving everyone wouldn't just mean sharing the resource, it would mean improving the system. That the Fenners and the Pritchards and Nell and even Castile, who said little but watched everything, would add things that she hadn't thought of. Thomas Fenner knew more about grain storage than she did, and pointed out 3 adjustments to the second chamber's use that extended the stable storage period by weeks. Denny Pritchard, who everyone had underestimated, including himself, turned out to have a memory for the geese that rivaled Mara's own. He started recognizing individual birds within his first 3 visits and began keeping his own notes, which he shared with her with a diffidence that suggested he wasn't sure they'd be welcome, and that made her work to show him they were. And Berta Vossler brought seeds, not to plant to store. Seed stock from the family's best-performing crops, properly dried and sealed in cloth packets, each one labeled in Berta's careful hand. She showed up one Tuesday in June with a bag of them and explained her thinking. The second chamber's temperature was better for long-term seed preservation than anything most of them had at home. And seeds were the thing that, if you lost them to a bad winter or a fire or a flood, took the longest to replace. If the cave could protect the valley's seed stock as well as its provisions, the margin of safety for everyone grew considerably. Mara stood in the second chamber with Berta and looked at the cloth packets being arranged along the western wall and felt something she reached for words to describe and couldn't quite reach, because the thing she was feeling was bigger than the words she had available. This was what she'd seen at the edge of her, thinking that winter, in the dark months when the cave had been just theirs and the thought of what it could be had been too large and too fragile to look at directly. She'd imagined it as a storehouse. It was becoming something more than a storehouse. Good idea, she told Berta. It was inadequate for what she meant, but it was honest. Berta patted her arm. You started it, she said, and went back to arranging seeds. The colony grew through the spring and summer, as Mara had predicted it would. By August, there were nearly 60 geese, which was a 50% increase. She'd from the 40 and Silas had arrived at the cave with, and the egg production had grown accordingly. The valley's first full summer using the system was not without difficulty. There was a dispute in July about a harvest where the Pritchard brothers had taken more than the agreed amount, not maliciously but carelessly, and The conversation that followed was uncomfortable for everyone and resolved in the way uncomfortable conversations about shared resources generally resolve when everyone has actually agreed on the rules, with acknowledgement and adjustment and a slightly heightened awareness of what was at stake. Mara chaired that conversation. She didn't particularly enjoy it. She said what needed to be said without letting it become more than it was, which was a mistake and a correction, not a betrayal. And afterward, Cal Pritchard came to the cabin and apologized directly to both her and Silas, and meant it. And Denny had clearly had words with his older brother, because for the next 6 weeks, Harmonious' records were almost aggressively precise. Not everything was resolved. Harlan Briggs participated in the system but stayed at its edges, contributing his share of the work, without ever becoming what she'd call a genuine partner in it. He was civil. He was reliable in the specific ways he'd committed to being reliable. He never again made a comment about her size or her competence or her right to be in any room she chose to be in. Whether that was growth or political calculation or some mixture of both, she couldn't fully tell, and she decided at some point in late summer that she didn't need to tell. People were complicated, and their reasons for behaving decently were often mixed, and the behavior was what the community required, not the purity of the reason behind it. She wrote this in the journal. She wrote a lot in the journal. The seasons turned. The second winter came, and it was hard, but not as hard as the first, and the cave's reserve held through it with room to spare, and nobody in the valley went hungry. The third winter was easier still. The fourth winter brought a new family, the Aldermans. A young couple from Ohio, and Mara was the one who sat down with them in their first week and explained about the cave, explained the rules, explained the record keeping, and watched their faces go through the same sequence of expression that the valley's original gathering had gone through on that April Sunday. Disbelief, then the warmth on their hands, then the chamber opening up in the lantern light, then something quieter and more serious than surprise. She answered the alderman husband's questions the same way she'd answered Harlan's. No one person has authority. The rules require everyone. If you need more rules, you make them together. He asked who'd discovered the cave. She told him their geese had found it, and she'd followed them. Years passed away. Years do not smoothly, not without loss, not without the particular cruelties that frontier life distributed without apparent logic or mercy. Henrik Vossler died, in the fifth winter quietly, in his sleep, and the valley felt his absence as a specific weight. Nell Harrow took on more of the cave's record-keeping and became, without anyone designating her as such, its de facto historian. The Fenner children grew up, knowing the cave, the way they knew the creek and the mountains shape against the sky, as a fact of the world they inhabited, something that had always been there. The girl who had sat on the warm floor and pressed her palms down and said, "Mama, the ground is warm." Her name was Clara, and by the time she was 12, she knew more about the cave's geological properties than anyone in the valley, because she started asking questions about the thermal floor that none of the adults had thought to ask, and had then pursued the answers with the particular single-mindedness of children who are genuinely curious, rather than performing curiosity for approval. She asked Mara about it one afternoon, the two of them sitting at the cave entrance in the fall light. "What makes the floor warm?" Clara said. "Something deep in the mountain," Mara said. "Heat from below." "How deep?" "I don't know," Mara said. "Far enough that we can't reach it. Close enough that we can feel it." Clara thought about this. "So the mountain is warm on the inside," she said, "and it's been warming these chambers this whole time, even before anyone knew. Even before the geese knew," Mara said, "was doing its job before any of us arrived. And it'll keep doing it after we're gone," Clara said. Not sadly, just observationally. "That's right," Mara said. Clara was quiet for a moment. She had the quality of a child who was actually sitting with an idea rather than moving through it to the next thing. Then she said, "Is that why you didn't keep it for yourself? Because it was already doing its job before you got there?" Mara looked at her. She was 12 years old and sitting on the cold ground outside a crack in a mountain, and she had arrived, through the logic of a child's clean reasoning. Most of its windows were dark, at something that Mara had spent 3 months circling around in the dark before she'd been able to name it. "That's part of it," Mara said. "What's the rest?" Mara thought about it. She thought about that November morning at the fence, and the look on Harlan Briggs's face, and the hot, slow anger she'd carried back to the cabin with her. She thought about lying awake in the storm with 183 eggs and a valley of people struggling through weather none of them had chosen. She thought about Nell's hands around hers in the cave on that April Sunday. She thought about Denny Pritchard's careful record-keeping and Berta Vossler's seed packets and Clara's own hands pressed flat against the warm floor with that expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. I was angry, Mara said, for a long time, at the people who looked at me and decided what I was capable of before they'd seen me do anything. She paused. And I could have used the cave to prove them wrong. Kept it. Thrived when everyone else struggled. Let them see eventually that they'd underestimated me. But you didn't, Clara said. No. Why not? Mara looked at the mountain. At the crack in the stone where 40 geese went every evening and came back out every morning, where warmth came out of the rock in November like a hand extended, where a valley's worth of seeds and provisions and emergency reserves sat in carefully recorded order in the cool and stable dark. Because being right is small, she said, and this is bigger than being right. Clara looked at the crack in the mountain. She looked at Mara. She was 12, and she would remember this conversation for the rest of her life, though she wouldn't know that yet. She would remember it the way you remember things that arrive before you're fully equipped to hold them, but that wait for you until you are. Okay, she said finally. Just that. They sat in the fall light for a while longer, not talking, listening to the geese make their way across the meadow in the long evening file, the sound of their feet in the dry grass, the occasional soft exchange between birds that Mara had spent years listening to and still only partly understood. Ink was still there. She recognized the darker patches on the neck, the particular way the bird held itself slightly separate from the nearest cluster, the way it had always been, since the first time Mara had named it by the light of a single candle in a chamber she hadn't known existed 20 minutes before. Old for a goose. Old in the way that survivors of difficult things often were present in a way that newer, easier lives weren't quite. Crooked was gone, had been gone since the fourth winter. Mara had noted it in the journal without elaborating, just the fact of it and the date, because some losses were small enough that you didn't need to explain them to anyone, and large enough that you didn't want to. The file of geese reached the juniper line, and the first ones disappeared into the shadow and the rest followed, and within a few minutes they were all inside the mountain, and the meadow was quiet with just the wind working through the grass. Mara stood up. Her knees made the noise they'd started making in the last year or two, a sound she had opinions about and no power over, which she'd concluded was just the frontier's way of being honest with her. Clara stood up too. She was almost as tall as Mara now, which was something. Same time Tamara said, "I'll be here," Mara said. She walked back across the meadow in the late light, the mountain behind her, the cabin ahead, the smoke from the chimney meaning Silas was already inside, and the fire was going, and there was something on the stove that she would have opinions about. The valley spread out around her in the amber light of October, the other homesteads visible in their places along the creek line, and up the gentle rises, smoke from most of them, lamps beginning to glow in windows against the coming dark. She thought about the journal and the entries she still wanted to write. She thought about the meeting they'd need to have before the winter to review the reserves and confirm the harvest ceiling for the season. She thought about the alderman wife, who was expecting a baby in February, and whether the second chamber's warmth might have any practical application there that she hadn't considered. She thought about a dozen things at once, the way she usually did, the way her mind had always worked not in single lines, but in parallel, multiple considerations running simultaneously, which some people the dark found difficult to follow and which she'd stopped apologizing for somewhere on the second winter. She reached the cabin door and stopped for a moment with her hand on the latch. Behind her, the mountain stood in the failing light, patient and indifferent in the way of mountains, doing what it had always done, warming the chambers inside with heat from somewhere too deep to name, holding the seeds and the eggs and the provisions of a valley that had learned slowly, and not without difficulty, to think of itself as something that endured together rather than survived alone. The geese were inside it now, settled on the stone floor, making the small sounds they made when everything was as it should be. Mara opened the cabin door and went in.